Peace and blessings, dear FBA family and friends. And I see some enemies. I am your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad. And these are the Dr. Muhammad Files. Welcome to another scholarly fire episode of the Dr. Muhammad Files. This episode launches a powerful and scholarly 7-part series where we examine how blacks built America: labor, culture, freedom, and democracy. A critical commentary grounded in the works of renowned scholar Dr. Joe Feagin. In this series, we spotlight the enduring and transformative contributions of foundational black Americans, those whose labor, intellect, culture, and resistance are interwoven into every corner of this nation's development. Through Feagin's analytical lens, we will challenge dominant myths, disrupt historical distortions, and reframe the narrative to reflect the truth that the building of America is inseparable from the struggle, brilliance, and resilience of black people, specifically those of foundational black American lineage. So, family, friends, and enemies, each episode in this series aligns with one of the book's 7 chapters. Together, we'll explore the pivotal roles black Americans have played in shaping this country, from forced labor and resistance to cultural innovation and ongoing pursuit of justice and democracy. These are the stories often ignored in mainstream discourse, but essential to any honest telling of American history. So join me as we reclaim the narrative, uplift the legacy, and speak truth to power. So let's get started.
Brothers and sisters and friends, and I see some enemies. In fact, I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we had an audience this large and didn't realize that there were some enemies present. In fact, I'm a black nationalist freedom fighter. The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. The time when white people can come in our community and get us to vote for them so that they can be our political leaders and tell us what to do and what not to do is long gone. By the same token, the time when that same white man, knowing that your eyes are too far open, can send another Negro into the community, get you and me to support him so he can use him to lead us astray, those days are long gone.
All right, FBA family, friends, and enemies. I want to give a strong shout out to my son, Tariq, for that fire intro. So before we begin, I want to emphasize the term foundational Black American to accurately reflect our identity. I'll use foundational American except when using direct quotes. I say this because Dr. Feagin, in his although masterful piece, he uses the misnomer of African American. We no longer identify as African American. That is of the past, just like the terms colored, Negro, and now we're putting to bed the misnomer of African American. We are not generic Africans. We had an ethnogenesis. We identify as foundational Black Americans, and that's how I will identify, except when using direct quotes. So let's get into it. So as we dive into chapter 1, titled White Racism, Black Resistance, based on the work of Dr. Feagin. This chapter pulls back the curtain on a deeply rooted mythology that dominates the American narrative. The ideal that the nation was built solely through white valor, hard work, and a commitment to liberty. But that's not the whole truth, not even close. Feagin opens up by confronting the central lie embedded in American mythology that the founding of this nation was a heroic effort toward democracy. In truth, the founding was also about preserving a system of white supremacy and rich white elites through the exploitation and dehumanization of black bodies. Over nearly 400 years, 60, listen to this, FBA family friends and enemies. You always hear about the Holocaust, the atrocity of the Holocaust, I might add. But you never hear about the nearly 400 years, 60 to 70 million black Americans, or as I'll refer to us in this space, foundational black Americans have survived and resisted a system built to keep us on the bottom. From chattel slavery and legal apartheid to redlining, police violence, and mass incarceration, our existence in this country has been shaped by a constant struggle against systemic anti-black racism, white supremacy. And yet, we've always resisted. You always hear about the docility of foundational black Americans. You never hear about all the rebellions. That resistance in all its forms, from revolts and uprisings to cultural creation and intellectual critique, has shaped the soul of this nation just as much as any founding document. I'll say that again. Our revolts and uprising has created the cultural and intellect of this nation just as much as any founding document. Feagin argues that an honest retelling of American history requires not just acknowledging these truths, but centering them. Centering them on the fact that foundational black Americans built America. That means rejecting sanitized textbooks and confronting the fact that many so-called heroes of the American Revolution were not fighting for universal freedom, and they weren't. They were fighting for white dominance. They were fighting to protect an economy powered by stolen black labor. That economy was built on the backs of our ancestors. Wasn't a side effect of the nation's founding. It was the foundation. I'll say that again. It wasn't a side effect of the nation's founding. That is our stolen black labor. It was the foundation. So in this episode, we're not just unpacking history. We're exposing how systemic anti-black racism was deliberately baked into the very structure of the United States from the beginning to now. Let's break it down. So when we talk about the founding of the United States, we're often fed a narrative of liberty, justice, and revolutionary ideals. But the reality is far more complex and far more brutal. The fact is, systemic anti-black racism wasn't something that developed after the founding. It was actually woven into the nation's blueprint, from the Constitution's third, fifth clause to laws that criminalize literacy for enslaved black people, to land theft and the denial of citizenship. We hear about the 14th Amendment right now, right? For illegal aliens. Well, that 14th Amendment was for foundational black Americans who were enslaved, period. No one else. I digress. That's for another podcast. But every major institution was designed, FBA family friends and you enemies, it was designed to protect white wealth and power while subjugating black bodies. Foundational black Americans were never meant to benefit from the quote unquote freedoms outlined in the founding documents. Our labor built the wealth of this nation. I'll say that again, foundational black American family, friends, and you enemies, you need to know this. Our labor built the wealth of this nation. Yet we were denied humanity in its laws. So when we say systemic racism is baked into America, we mean that it's not a glitch, it's the system functioning exactly as it was intended. Understanding that truth is the first step toward what? Dismantling it. These points, they highlight the reality that systemic anti-black racism was an unintended consequence. It was intentionally embedded in the nation's legal, political, and economic foundations. From the Constitution itself to the legal codes that criminalize black life, every institution was designed to protect white supremacy. Not my words, white supremacy, but their words. And the wealth this country enjoys. It was built on the backs of enslaved foundational black Americans without compensation, without justice. That's why when we talk about dismantling anti-black racism, reparations, we have to understand we're not fighting a broken system. We're challenging a system functioning as it was intended. So when we say systemic anti-black racism was baked into the founding of this country, we're not speaking in a metaphoric sense. We're speaking to a documented reality. Empirical evidence shows this. In fact, Dr. Joe Feagin breaks this down in chapter 1 under the section Systemic Racism, Its White Frame. He outlines exactly how anti-black racism has functioned as a foundational operating system in the U.S. Not just a series of individual acts or isolated events. He writes, over the long history of white oppression of Americans of color, racism has been systemic and foundational and has excuse me, and has included one, the many exploitive and discriminatory practices of whites, two, the significant resources, privileges, and power unjustly gained by whites and institutionalized in a dominant racial hierarchy. Three, the maintenance of substantial racial inequalities by well institutionalized social reproduction mechanisms. And four, the many racial prejudices, stereotypes, images, ideologies, emotions, interpretations, and narratives that constitute the dominant white racial frame, the worldview that rationalizes and implements everyday racial oppression. In other words, family, FBA family, friends, and of course you enemies, the system isn't broken. It was built this way. And that white racial frame Feagin refers to, it's not just about attitudes. It's a structure embedded in laws, media, institutions, and just everyday practices that continues to uphold anti-black oppression and anti-black racism, especially against foundational black Americans. You hear all the time, oh, you're not oppressed. We're not speaking individually. We're speaking systemic. So when we think about systemic, right, we think of how American history is taught, right? Institutions like education, K through 12, higher education, from elementary to higher ed. Black presence is often reduced to suffering and victimhood, right? They always tell us stop being a victim, right? But what's consistently erased is our resistance. Foundational black Americans have never been passive recipients of white oppression. We have never been docile Negroes. From the moment of enslavement, we resisted through rebellions, escapes, maroon communities, abolitionists, organizing, and cultural subversion. And yet, see, when we talk about systemic, we talk about the mainstream narratives often highlight things like white abolitionists while minimizing or just completely omitting the revolutionary actions of black folks. Resistance is sanitized, criminalized, or even reframed to fit a narrative that upholds whiteness as savior and blackness as dependent on white mommy, white daddy. We're going to get real today, FBA family, friends, and you enemies. This erasure serves a purpose. It actually removes the radical legacy of black agency and resilience from public consciousness. Because to recognize our resistance is to recognize what? Our black power. But in this space, we center that power, we name it, we honor it, and we restore it to the narrative where it always belonged. In fact, Dr. Feagin makes it plain. This erasure is no accident. In his section called Covering Up Racist History, he confronts the consequences of telling the truth about black resistance and white oppression. He asks, what happens when we actually tell an accurate story of African Americans in United States history? He opined, given the massive historical cover up, what are the contemporary consequences of telling an accurate story of the role of African Americans in U.S. history? Bringing an honest account of white on black oppression and black resistance to oppression into the retelling and writing of U.S. history would require a dramatic change in that history's overall presentation and general interpretation. Feagin reminds us that an honest retelling would fundamentally disrupt the myth of American white exceptionalism. Why? Because the true story is bloody, immoral, and enduring. It reveals a nation built not only through exploitation, but also shaped by constant black defiance, acts of rebellion that whitewashed history has tried to bury. But today, FBA family, friends, and yes, you enemies, we're going to uncover the truth. Dr. Feagin writes, over nearly 4 centuries, a great many Africans and African Americans fought back, highlighting slave revolts, shipboard resistance, and everyday acts of sabotage. These were not isolated incidents, family, friends, and enemies. At least 300 documented revolts took place during U.S. slavery. That's only the ones documented. How many more were not documented? Yet, how many of these stories appear in our textbooks? You may hear about one, Nat Turner, maybe. This historical cover up does more than distort the past. It shapes how black people are perceived and even treated today by ignoring our legacy of resistance. Society continues to paint foundational black Americans solely as victims, not as revolutionaries who helped reshape the very foundations of this country. So, as we continue this conversation, let's center that resistance, not as a footnote, but as a core element of what it means to be foundational black American in a nation that has always tried to erase our power. When we bring foundational black Americans to the center of the story, not as side characters, side notes, not as victims, but as builders, resistors, and visionaries. Everything changes. It forces us to confront a reality that many are still uncomfortable with. They talk about getting all the history out of books. This one of the reasons why they want to erase black history is because they feel uncomfortable at telling the truth. That this nation's wealth, its democracy, and its culture. I'll say that again. The nation's wealth, its democracy, and its culture were all shaped in direct response to our presence, our free labor, and our resistance. So understanding that truth shifts the foundation of American history. And it demands that we tell a different story moving forward. One that's honest, one that's whole. And when we talk about recentering the truth, about understanding this country's past and present through the lens of foundational black Americans, we also have to talk about how that truth has been consistently distorted. Dr. Feagin makes this point crystal clear in his section called Positive Black Exceptionalism. He writes, well until the 21st century, and assisted by the mass media and popular culture, this negative framing has commonly exaggerated and racialized notions of gang members, thugs, lazy workers, or welfare recipients. This white pattern has been true for many decades. That's the legacy, FBA family friends, and I know you enemies still lurking. That's the legacy of the white racial frame, a system of ideas and images that distorts who we are as FBA. It erases our brilliance and devalues our contributions. It doesn't just rewrite the past. If you think about it, it reshapes how we are treated in the present. But Feagin doesn't stop at the problem. He reminds us of something powerful. He continues, there is an extraordinarily important and positive black exceptionalism that is constantly revealed in the centuries long history of this society. That's the true story we're telling in this series. Not just the pain, but the power. Not just the oppression, but the resistance, the genius, the legacy. In future episodes, we'll actually unpack that black exceptionalism in depth through our intellectual traditions, our cultural innovations, and the radical courage that defines the foundational black American experience. So, FBA family, friends, and enemies, as we close out this first episode, remember the dominant narrative was never meant to include us. Not truthfully, not wholly, but through this series, we are reclaiming the frame. We are centering the voices, the resistance, and the brilliance of foundational black Americans through our excellent work with Dr. Feagin. So remember, the fight for foundational black American recognition is far from over, but through education, activism, and self-determination, we will reclaim our rightful place in history. Our ancestors built this nation brick by brick, law by law, institution by institution. And now it is our duty to secure the justice, wealth, and legacy they were denied. The future of FBA empowerment is in our hands, and together we will shape it. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the truth and chart the path forward. Please like the podcast, subscribe, share it, and comment below. Signing off, your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad, and these are the Dr. Muhammad Files.